Hello, my name's Liz McCallum and I'd like to talk about Citizens Assemblies. I am by no means an expert. This is just information that I've got through becoming interested in Extinction Rebellion, and it was one of their 3 demands that they made. If you have any questions about Citizens Assemblies, then please do write them down in the chat, and hopefully those questions will be answered while the presentation is carrying on. And if not, I can try and answer the questions at the end. So I'd like to look at the following. What is a Citizens Assembly? Secondly, how is it done? Moving on to why is it an XR demand? Giving some examples of those assemblies, and finally, I'd like to hear your views and to try and answer some of the questions. So, if we look at Extinction Rebellion's 3 demands, these really came about in response to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which came about in 2018. And this is really shocking information, saying that if we didn't do something very quickly, then we faced real dire problems. It's not that we didn't know about these problems beforehand, but nothing had actually been done. And the report, in response to the report, it stated that tackling the climate and ecological emergency would require far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. So, as I said, Extinction Rebellion have and had 3 demands, and the first one being tell the truth, for the government to tell the truth about the severity and the seriousness of this emergency, climate and ecological emergency. And secondly, to act now in order to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. And one of the ways to do that was to involve people in the decision making of how to combat and how to fight climate change. And it was really seen as being government-led by the people rather than by an elite. And it was to create, the third demand was to create a national Citizens Assembly on climate and ecological justice. Okay, so what is a Citizens Assembly? Well, it's a group of people, typically between 40 and 200 people. If the smaller it is, the more time that is needed. And who are brought together a bit like a jury, except that in a jury you don't get to ask questions, whereas in a Citizens Assembly you do. And also, unlike a jury, it's not compulsory. So if you are called to to take part in a jury, it's very difficult to get out of, but you are invited to a Citizens Assembly. So people are brought together to learn about certain issues and to discuss and ask questions based on impartial information gathered about those issues, and to reach conclusions and make suggestions about what they think should happen. So people are chosen to reflect the wider population, and it's like a microcosm, and it reflects the demographics of the population in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, educational level, social class, geographical location, and attitudes. So you might have someone who is really not interested in climate issues at all, and you might have someone who's extremely interested, and they'll all be together. So why have Extinction Rebellion called for a Citizens Assembly? We've got democracy, haven't we? So, well, what is it? If we just base our idea of democracy on elections, then surely the world is becoming more democratic because more elections are being held worldwide. However, there is a feeling that the system is not working for many. And for example, lack of engagement. I remember coming back from living abroad and wanting to get involved in some local politics, find out how it worked. And I was really taken aback about how antiquated and some of the rituals that were gone through seemed very kind of antiquated and not really for today's fast-paced world. And I can imagine that younger people would be totally turned off by this. In this country, we have first past the post system. So in the last election, the government won by a massive 43.6% majority. So if that's a majority, what about all the others whose voices are not heard? And it's just one choice every 5 years, although that has been slightly different recently. And one of the problems is that it's very much about short-termness. The solutions are short-term. Governments are in for a limited amount of time, but when we're looking at really long-term strategies and policies to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss, we need long-term solutions for a problem that's going to carry on. Also, that under this system there are entrenched ideologies, and it's really about this is our party and this is what we believe in, and the opposite, and so that it's all polarized. And there's also the feeling that there are some unelected members of the government who are employed by the government who have a huge amount of power and sway. So this is kind of, you know, and the funding. Where is the funding coming from? It could be media backed, which is very much funded by certain members of society who have a lot of money and have a vested interest in certain things. So also that our current democracy is not evidence-based. So decisions are not evidence-based. So people will be swayed by very knee-jerk yes-no reactions, some sort of partially informed ideas, but they haven't sat down and talked about it and really been given impartial information. So citizens' assemblies are set up also, or why Extinction Rebellion wanted to introduce citizens' assemblies, was to get to grips with some very difficult issues and to also break deadlock. So, for example, in the Irish Republic, which held a citizens' assembly, there were 99 assembly attendees, and they made suggestions on changing the abortion law, which then led to a referendum. So here were people who were really polarised at the beginning and came together, listened to certain ideas, listened to people who they normally wouldn't have spoken to or listened to, and it was all about listening and understanding and asking questions, and then coming together to make a suggestion. And then they did make a suggestion, and which led then to a referendum. So okay, so it's really what it's working towards more deliberative form of democracy, talking, listening, trying to understand, rather than representative democracy. But that's not to say we need both. We need both. When I say representative, I mean parliamentary democracy, and also Citizens Assembly, where people are really involved and engaged and understand the issues and try and work out a solution together. Just as an aside, do you know the maximum fine for fraudulently winning an election or referendum in the UK? It's £20,000. Almost worth it. So how's it done? So we go back to ancient Athens, and they based the foundation of democracy, which was called a method of sortition. And what they did was, on a daily basis, people would be randomly selected from the society in order for them to get together and for them to discuss the issues of the day and to make suggestions. So it was about self-governance. So you took turns in governing and being governed. However, this particular method of doing it then was not very equal, because women couldn't take part in this form of democracy. They weren't allowed to. Slaves weren't allowed to take part, and also if you didn't have a certain amount of money, you couldn't take part. So it wasn't really fair. But nowadays, stratification is used, and that really means that from your random group, your sortition, you would then fine-tune that, and so that that group becomes representative of society as a whole. So a mini society and a microcosm. And as we said, it would represent people from different backgrounds and social classes and attitudes, and you would have like 50-50 divide of men and women, because that reflects the greater society. So it's evidence-based, whereby people listen to impartial information, they ask questions, so they're experts. There might be lobby groups as well. There might be individuals who have been particularly affected by the issue being discussed. So it's a whole range of people they will listen to, not just one section. So in the end, you get public judgment rather than just public opinion, not the visceral kind of yes, knee jerk, no, I don't like that, that's no good. You have people who have sat down, talked about it, listened to information, discussed it, and then come up with a solution or a suggestion together. So time is given for these assemblies, and they're usually held over 1 or 2 weekends or more. They are funded, which means that participants get a nominal fee, a nominal rate, maybe just to cover costs. And it's also transparent, in as much as you know exactly who's organising, and those talks will be recorded. So there's always a record, video recorded, and also the suggestions and the recommendations will be recorded. Not necessarily shown with people's faces, but the outcomes will be recorded. So, okay, we're going for a starter for 10. Where and when was the first Citizens Assembly held in the world? So, if you said Canada, you'd be right. And any idea when? Well, if you said 2004, you'd also be right. So in Canada, they set up a Citizens Assembly to discuss whether to change the voting system in British Columbia. And they recommended change, and then this was put to a referendum. And there have been many examples of Citizens Assemblies around the world since. Holland has employed this method on many occasions, and also Belgium. So which city was the first city to hold a Citizens Assembly on climate change in the UK? No prizes, by the way. And if you said Oxford, you'd be right. And what about a national Citizens Assembly? Well, yes, one has just finished, and that was from people who were invited from all over the UK, and we'll be looking at that in a minute. But I would like to go on to look at Oxford first. With the Citizens Assembly in Oxford, there were only 50 delegates. I think at the end of the weekends, it was only 45. It was rather overrepresented by those who were graduates. And the overarching question that they were looking at was, should Oxford be more proactive in seeking to achieve net zero emissions sooner than 2050? And they also looked at what trade-offs they were prepared to make. So they looked at 3 areas as well. So that's what I want you to listen for.
So a Citizens Assembly is where a group of people are brought together to discuss a particular issue or issues and decide a way forwards. So typically we've seen these done for abortion in Ireland, equal marriage in different places around the world, and as we're increasingly seeing, climate change. The process we went through to recruit Assembly members was that with our work with the City Council, we already had a panel of Oxford residents that was broadly reflective of the demographic makeup of the city. So we went to those panel members and asked them if they'd be willing to take part. Clearly then, as ever with any sort of research project like this, that's never going to be exactly how you want it to be. It's not going to look exactly like Oxford itself. So we then went out and did some what we call free find recruitment in street to try and balance out some of the gaps in that demographic.
I'm not grown up by going to ecological protests. My parents don't have a history of environmental activism.
I was just blown, when I saw a young person speaking passionately about the climate change. From that moment, I just knew, we are headed in the right direction. And, we have a complete team, people from diverse background, different career backgrounds, age difference, cultural differences, But I just saw all that team is, in one room talking about the same thing, it just gave me more and more, optimism.
to get to those really tricky emissions in heavy industry, heavy transport, and potentially other areas of the economy too.
The first weekend that we were here, we heard from a range of expert speakers from a variety of perspectives, talking about biodiversity, housing, transport, renewable energy and waste.
But hopefully thinking about energy will tie up some of the stuff that I know you've been thinking about yesterday.
It was a very intense process, I won't lie. It was a lot of information to take in, but it was very important to have those 3 weeks between the weekends to reflect, talk to other people, see how other people would react to the proposals we would make in the second week.
There were different ways of looking at the solution, and that really kind of helped, because the table was open and everybody got an opportunity to say. There was no right or wrong answer, which I think is a brilliant idea. The process is well designed, was very well designed. After the first weekend we had a 2 weeks break, which was kind of a good reflection time.
We had experts talking to us on lots of different subjects. We were then able to have a discussion around the table about how we took everything from those experts, and then we were able to apply that to lots of different questions and scenarios.
We need to stop the warming by mid-century if we're to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So as I keep coming back to, this is what we learn from the data, from what's already happened.
The way we approach any sort of Citizens Assembly piece of work is that we would spend an initial period of time with our Assembly members, letting them get to grips with the issues, hearing from experts in the area.
Your wealth makes a difference between how you can deal with the impacts of climate change, and the embedded wealth is really important. So UK is the 5th most responsible for historical emissions.
And then we give them a bit of a break to really think about what they'd heard, to go away and talk to family and friends, talk to colleagues, reread some of the materials that they'd seen over the first weekend, just to let them come to terms and get to grips with some of those issues, let them get the views of other people that matter to them in their lives. And then we asked them all to come back to reconvene, and again we did a Saturday and a Sunday consecutively, and on that second weekend, that's where we're really asking people to think about what should be done about climate change, and what should Oxford do as a city, what do residents do, what should the council be doing about these things. We put them through a range of different voting exercises to try and focus their decision making. Finally, towards the end of the final weekend, of the Sunday, we asked them to maybe vote on some really simple kind of issues around how ambitious should Oxford be. So that's how we approach this, which is pretty much the sort of standard approach to doing any sort of Citizens Assembly.
But it's been really refreshing, because over the whole 2 weekends, nobody's mentioned party politics at all, and I haven't got a clue what other people's voting preferences are. It just feels like we've been a really cohesive group of people rising above party politics in order to address this, kind of common concern.
I think that these weekends have been extremely useful. I've got no criticism whatsoever. I would like to see, like I said, such reunion to see what we've done in the meantime, other than, okay, great, we've had 4 days together, spread over 2 weekends, and then the steam just runs out of everybody. Because I feel that these weekends have been extremely productive, educational, and I wouldn't want to see that go to waste, actually.
I think my main thing to take away is actually to open my eyes to the number of possibilities there are in terms of tackling climate change.
I represent one of the many low-carbon groups in Oxford and Oxfordshire, dozens in the county as a whole, that have been working on climate change for decades.
My main takeaway is that the climate problem is more solvable than I would have previously thought, and we just need to set out the concrete steps to do this.
And I think my overall impression of the weekend is I was proud to be in Oxford, and that Oxford was doing this.
I was travelling a lot by car, and I've started already before this to move to travelling to work by bus. doing that more, and then hopefully the buses will become electric buses, and we can and I can also have a good reason for working from home more often.
Just to thank the City Council for this opportunity, and to thank all the other audience participants for giving me the opportunity to discuss with them.
So there you go. Actually, it wasn't just 3 areas. There were a number of areas that they looked at: transport, biodiversity, waste, energy, renewable energy and buildings. There's probably another one as well. The question of whether they had to reduce emissions didn't even come into it. So that wasn't even, that was a given. And the questions that they were looking at to achieve net zero emissions sooner than 2050, the outcomes were 90% said that Oxford needed to be moving more quickly, and 75% supported radical outcomes. Sometimes when you have these assemblies, you get some really incredible ideas that nobody's thought of before. 80% of those taking place saw it as a way to do democracy differently. And the council response was they will set a climate emergency budget that commits over £1 million additional operational funding. But what I took away from that was, watching that clip, and I hope you could watch it or you could hear it, was people's enthusiasm. People felt engaged. That it wasn't about party politics. They didn't even know what party other people supported. It was about solving problems together, which is really good for the cohesion in a community. So that's how it was done in a city. So let's move on to a national Citizens Assembly. And so one has just finished, and it was held over several weekends from January 2020 until May this year. Some of the input sessions had to be held virtually because of COVID. And the aim of the Assembly was to discuss how the UK can meet its legal obligation to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. So in June 2019, remember in April, there had been some protests up in London by Extinction Rebellion. And in June 2019, 6 select committees of the House of Commons called a Citizens Assembly to understand public preferences on how the UK should tackle climate change. And as you know, select committees are a group of MPs from different political parties, and they examine party policy issues. And they hold the government to account and make proposals for new laws. So if we have a look at the first part of how it was done with the random selection, the sortition, 30,000 invitations were sent out to households across the UK, inviting them to a Citizens Assembly, a National Citizens Assembly. 80% of those were randomly selected from the Royal Mail address file, and then 20% from the most deprived areas where they expected a lower response rate from those sources. So from the 80 and 20, that people could reply and said yes, they were interested in taking part in the National Citizens Assembly, get the right teeth in, and then from the number who said they were interested, there was like a computer lottery, and the final number was 110 delegates or Citizens Assembly attendees. Okay, so these people came for over several weekends, and sometimes it was virtually. It was I don't know if it was a Zoom. They listened to it. I don't know how they did it, but it was done via computer. And they listened to experts. And the speakers were selected by an independent organisation facilitator, which was a leading public participation charity called Involve. And they did the organisation, and they selected the speakers. They recruited the speakers. And the speakers were divided up into informants and advocates. And the informants explained the range of views or options on the topic, and the advocates were asked to present their personal opinion. And if we look at 3, read submissions from the public, there are also how individuals might feel about these different subjects and how they personally have been affected. So they listened to all this information from experts. They could ask questions, and then in groups they deliberated. So and the deliberation, the chatting, the talking together, the listening, trying to understand was facilitated by professional facilitators. So in groups you wouldn't just have one person dominating, and everybody had a chance to express their opinion. And after that they take votes, as you saw in Oxford. They vote on different suggestions and outcomes. And then we move on to 6, which is the government debates and implements recommendations. Now, a report is due to go to Parliament from the National Citizens Assembly that's just finished, and it's due to go a report to Parliament this July. Now let's have a look at 6 with the government debates and implementations. This is really crucial because is it clear if the government have to actually take these recommendations on board? So can the government, after all that, just say, well, that's very interesting, but actually we're not going to take those suggestions on board? Well, originally Extinction Rebellion had stipulated that the government should agree before the meetings when they would respond, so it should be time bounded, and that if the Climate Assembly attendees made recommendations that received approximately 80% consensus, then that should be binding. Now this is also hasn't been addressed. So you can get people who've spent their weekends, got really fired up, really interested. It goes to debate in the House of Commons, and then actually they vote not to implement those recommendations. It is possible. So going back to the 3 demands now, tell the truth, act now, and the 3rd demand, which was to have a national citizens assembly. Well, you could say yes, the Extinction Rebellion have had those needs met. But let's have a look again.
Extinction Rebellion is calling for a UK Citizens Assembly on climate and ecological justice. You might have heard about Climate Assembly UK, with over 100 randomly selected people from across the country. You might be thinking, great, we got what we demanded. But this climate assembly is a token effort that won't solve anything. That's because it's working to an absurd 2050 target for net zero emissions. 2050 is way too late. It also ignores all emissions from trade and the mass extinction of animals and plants, as well as the fact that countries like the UK have a responsibility to act faster than others. And to top it all, the government can choose to ignore the recommendations of this climate assembly. We need a citizens' assembly that considers everything, one the government has to take seriously and can't ignore. And we need it now. Our demand still stands. The system is broken, but together we can fix it. For more information, follow the Citizens Assembly Working Group on Twitter or visit rebellion.earth.
Okay, well there you go. No, it's really over to you. What are your views? What do you think about it? Do you think it could work in your city, district, council? We do still need a national citizens assembly though, as Extinction Rebellion suggests. And really it cannot come too soon. Up here are some links. So from the Oxford Citizens Assembly and also the Climate Assembly UK, where there are so many really incredible resources. 5-10 minute video clips that can be used to understand different issues. So I really think, if anything, it's just really useful as a resource. Thank you very much. If you have any other questions, please get in touch. Thank you. Bye.